Somewhere in the western Sahara Desert, in the country of Mauritania, there is a geological formation so enormous that astronauts use it as a landmark from space. It's called the Rishat structure, but most people know it by another name, the Eye of the Sahara. A series of concentric rings stretching nearly 50 kilometers across, carved into the earth like a giant bullseye in the middle of nowhere. For decades, geologists dismissed it as a natural dome, an uplift of ancient rock eroded over millions of years. Case closed, move on, nothing to see here. But in the last few years, something changed. People started looking more carefully. They started comparing the Rishat structure to the oldest and most famous description of a lost city ever written. A description left by Plato, the Greek philosopher, over 2,400 years ago. A city of concentric rings, a city surrounded by water, a city of extraordinary wealth and knowledge that was destroyed in a single day and night. Atlantis. And when you lay Plato's description over the Eye of the Sahara, ring for ring, measurement for measurement, something happens that is very difficult to explain away. Tonight, we're going deep. I'm going to walk you through Plato's original text, line by line. Then, I'm going to show you the Rishat structure, feature by feature. And I'm going to let you decide whether this is coincidence, misinterpretation, or the most overlooked archaeological site on the planet. I want to be upfront about something. I'm not here to tell you Atlantis was definitely real. I'm here to show you evidence that deserves serious attention. Evidence that mainstream archaeology has largely ignored. Whether that evidence convinces you is your decision. But by the end of this, I promise you'll never look at the Sahara Desert the same way again. Let's start where every Atlantis investigation should start, with Plato himself. Most people who talk about Atlantis have never actually read what Plato wrote. They've absorbed it through movies, books, TV shows, conspiracy forums, layers and layers of interpretation piled on top of the original source, until the source itself is buried. So let's strip it back. Plato describes Atlantis in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. In these texts, he tells a story that he claims was passed down from the great Athenian statesman Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests at the city of Sais. According to these priests, there existed a powerful civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar. This civilization existed roughly 9,000 years before Solon's time, which puts its destruction at approximately 9,600 BCE. Now, here's the critical detail that most people miss. Plato doesn't just say there was a place called Atlantis. He gives specific, detailed, almost architectural descriptions. He describes a city built on a low hill, surrounded by alternating rings of water and land. He gives dimensions. He describes the materials used. He describes the layout. Let me walk you through the key details exactly as Plato presents them. First, the structure. Atlantis was built on a hill or mound, located on a large flat plain near the sea. Around this central hill, the builders carved alternating rings of water and land, 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, all concentric, all perfectly circular, radiating outward from the center. Second, the dimensions. Plato gives specific measurements. The central island was about 5 stadia in diameter, that's roughly 900 meters. The rings of water and land had specific widths. The outer ring of water was 3 stadia wide. The total diameter of the ringed city was approximately 127 stadia, about 23 kilometers. Third, the plain. The city sat on the southern edge of a vast rectangular plain, surrounded on three sides by mountains and open to the sea on the south. This plain was enormous, 3,000 by 2,000 stadia, roughly 555 by 370 kilometers, and it was irrigated by a massive canal system. Fourth, the location. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, facing the sea, on a continent. Fifth, the destruction. Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night, and sank beneath the waves. Now, for centuries, people have searched for Atlantis in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, near Antarctica, under the ocean. Hundreds of proposed locations. None of them match Plato's description with any precision. And then, someone looked at the eye of the Sahara. The Rishat structure sits in Mauritania, in northwest Africa. Let me describe what we're looking at. From above, and you really need to see this from above to grasp it, the Rishat structure is a series of concentric rings. A central dome surrounded by ridges and valleys that radiate outward in near-perfect circles. The total diameter is approximately 40 to 50 kilometers, depending on how you measure the outer boundaries. The central plateau is elevated, a low hill or dome rising above the surrounding terrain. Around it, rings of rock alternate with lower channels. The whole structure sits on the edge of a large, relatively flat expanse, the Saharan Plateau. Now let's compare. Plato says, a city built on a central hill surrounded by concentric rings. The Rishat structure, a central dome surrounded by concentric rings. Plato says, alternating rings of water and land. The Rishat structure, alternating ridges and channels. Today, those channels are dry. But geological evidence shows that this region was not always desert. Plato says, the city was approximately 23 kilometers in diameter. The Rishat structure, the inner rings measure approximately 23.5 kilometers across. Plato says, the city sat on the southern edge of a large flat plain, with mountains on three sides and open to the sea on the south. The Rishat structure sits on the southern edge of a large plateau, with the Atlas Mountains to the north and west, and the terrain opens southward toward what was once, during wetter climatic periods, a vast green landscape connected to waterways. I want to pause here because I need you to absorb this. The dimensional match is not approximate. It's not sort of close. It's within a few percent, ring for ring, measurement for measurement. The concentric structure, the central hill, the dimensions, the geographic orientation, all of it lines up. Now, does that prove this is Atlantis? No. Coincidences exist. Geological formations can look like man-made structures. But the precision of the match deserves more than a dismissive shrug. It deserves investigation. Here's where the story gets really interesting. The Sahara Desert was not always a desert. This is established science, not speculation. During a period known as the African Humid Period, roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. It had rivers, lakes, grasslands, and forests. It supported large human populations. Rock art found across the Sahara depicts cattle, hippos, crocodiles, boats, and people swimming. In the middle of what is now the driest desert on Earth, the Rishat structure sits squarely within this region. During the African Humid Period, the channels around the Rishat structure would have held water. The area would have been habitable, even hospitable. Rivers flowed through this region. Lakes existed nearby. In other words, during the time period Plato assigns to Atlantis, roughly 9,600 BCE, which falls within the African humid period, the Richat structure would have been a ringed formation surrounded by water on a green and fertile plain near the Atlantic coast. That matches Plato's description almost exactly. Now here's the part that keeps me up at night. As the African humid period ended, the climate shifted. The rains stopped, the rivers dried, the lakes disappeared. The Sahara became the desert we know today. The water around the Richat structure evaporated. If a civilization existed here, and if it depended on that water, it would have been destroyed, not by a sudden catastrophe, but by a slow, grinding climate collapse. Its buildings would have been buried under sand. Its population would have dispersed. Its memory would have faded. And 5,000 years later, Egyptian priests might have told a visiting Greek statesman about a great civilization that once existed beyond the Western Mountains, a civilization of rings and water that was destroyed and disappeared. I think about what Plato actually wrote. He says Atlantis was destroyed and sank beneath the waves. What if the waves weren't ocean waves? What if the civilization didn't sink into the sea? What if the sea sank away from the civilization? What if the water simply left? That's not what Plato describes. But Plato was writing a story he heard third-hand, through translation, across thousands of years. Details change. Metaphors replace facts. The water disappeared and the city died becomes the city sank beneath the water. The core truth, a ringed city destroyed by the loss of water, might survive even if the narrative details shift. This is speculation. I'm flagging it as speculation. But it's speculation grounded in real geology, real climatology, and real textual analysis. And it deserves better than being ignored. Let's address the skeptics. Because skepticism is healthy and the objections are real. Objection 1. Plato made it up. Atlantis was a philosophical allegory, not a real place. This is the mainstream academic position, and it has merit. Plato used stories to illustrate philosophical points. Atlantis appears in dialogues about ideal societies and hubris. It's entirely possible that Plato invented the story to make a point about civilizational arrogance. But here's the counter. Plato explicitly says this is a true story, passed down from Solon through his family. He names the sources. He gives specific details, measurements, materials, geography that would be unusual for a pure allegory. Most philosophical parables don't include architectural blueprints. Does Plato's claim of truth make it true? No. Writers claim their fiction is true all the time. But the specificity is notable. If you're inventing a parable, you don't usually specify that the outer ring of water was exactly 3 stadia wide. Objection 2. The Richat structure is a natural geological formation, not a city. This is accurate. Geologists classify the Richat structure as a dome, an uplifted section of ancient rock that has been eroded over time, revealing the concentric ring pattern. No excavation has found buildings, artifacts, or other evidence of habitation at the site. But, and this is important, no serious archaeological excavation has ever been conducted at the Richat structure. It sits in one of the most remote and inaccessible regions on Earth. The handful of geological surveys that have been done focused on rock composition, not on searching for artifacts. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We haven't found anything because we haven't looked. And we haven't looked because the mainstream position is that there's nothing to find. That might be correct, but it's a circular argument. We don't look because we assume there's nothing. We find nothing because we don't look. And then we point to finding nothing as proof that there's nothing. Objection 3. The dimensions don't match perfectly. Fair point. Plato's description doesn't match the Rishat structure exactly. The total diameter varies depending on how you measure. Some of the ring widths don't align precisely. But consider this. Plato was recording a story that had been transmitted orally across thousands of years through at least 3 languages, from the original civilization to Egyptian priests to Solon in Greek to Plato's family to Plato. Exact measurements wouldn't survive that chain perfectly. The fact that the dimensions are close, within the range of reasonable transmission error, is more remarkable than the fact that they're not identical. Objection 4. The location doesn't match. Plato says Atlantis was an island in the Atlantic Ocean. Plato says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Rishat structure is beyond the Pillars of Hercules, just not in the ocean. It's inland. But remember the African humid period. When the Sahara was green and wet, the Western Sahara was much closer to navigable waterways. River systems connected inland areas to the Atlantic coast. A civilization at the Rishat structure would have had water access to the sea. And again, Plato's account is a transmission across millennia. A great civilization near the Western Sea could easily become an island in the Western Sea over thousands of years of retelling. I'm not dismissing these objections. Each one has force, but none of them is a knockout blow. And the combined weight of the matching details, the rings, the dimensions, the geography, the climate timeline, creates a case that is, at minimum, worthy of serious investigation. So why hasn't anyone investigated? This is the question that frustrates me most. The answer, I think, is institutional inertia. Archaeology, like any academic discipline, has established positions. The established position on Atlantis is that it's fiction. Any researcher who proposes investigating a real Atlantis risks their career, their funding, and their reputation. This isn't conspiracy, it's sociology. Academic fields have orthodoxies. Challenging orthodoxy has consequences. And so the Rishat structure sits in the desert, uninvestigated, because investigating it would mean taking Atlantis seriously, and taking Atlantis seriously is career suicide in academic archaeology. There are exceptions. A handful of independent researchers have examined the site. Some geological surveys have been conducted. Satellite imagery has been analyzed. But no full-scale, systematic archaeological investigation has ever been attempted. Meanwhile, the site erodes further. If there were artifacts, pottery, tools, structural remains, they've been exposed to wind and sand for thousands of years. Every decade that passes without investigation is a decade of evidence potentially lost. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not qualified to lead an excavation. But I am qualified to ask, why not look? What is the cost of looking and finding nothing versus the cost of not looking and missing everything? If the Rishat structure is just a geological formation, then investigating it would confirm that. The scientific method works in both directions. It can disprove hypotheses as well as prove them. An investigation that finds nothing is still valuable science. But if the Rishat structure contains any evidence of ancient habitation, any artifacts, any structural remains, any signs of human modification, that would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history. The risk-reward calculation seems obvious to me, and yet nothing happens. Let me take you deeper into something most people overlook: the water system. Plato describes an elaborate canal and irrigation system around Atlantis. The Great Plain was crisscrossed by channels, connected to the sea by a large canal. Water flowed through the ringed city, providing transport, irrigation, and connection to the outside world. Now look at the Rishat structure from satellite imagery. The channels between the rings show clear evidence of water erosion. The geological record shows that water flowed through these channels during the African humid period. The topography of the surrounding region shows what appear to be ancient riverbeds and drainage patterns consistent with a substantial water system. Is this proof of human engineering? No. Water naturally follows geological channels. Erosion creates patterns that can look intentional. But the scale and organization of the water features around the Rishat structure are noteworthy. And they match, in general layout, if not in every detail, the water system Plato describes. There's another detail that deserves attention. Plato mentions that the rocks of Atlantis were of different colors: red, black, and white stone. The Rishat structure contains rocks of different ages and compositions, and they do indeed vary in color, including reddish, dark, and lighter tones. Geological surveys have documented this variation. Again, this doesn't prove anything by itself, but it's another data point in a growing list of correspondences that, taken together, form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. Let me broaden the lens for a moment. Because the Rishat structure doesn't exist in isolation, there's a larger question here about what we know and what we assume about ancient human civilization. The standard model of human history says that civilization began around 4000 to 3000 BCE in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Before that, humans were hunter-gatherers, capable, intelligent, but not building cities or developing complex societies. But in the last few decades, that timeline has been challenged repeatedly. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a monumental stone temple complex dating to approximately 9600 BCE, built by people we classified as hunter-gatherers. It required organization, planning, and engineering knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist for another 6,000 years. Gunung Padang in Indonesia, a megalithic site with structures that some researchers date to over 20,000 years ago, though this is hotly debated. Underwater structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, submerged sites that would have been above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower. The pattern is consistent. Every few years, we discover evidence that human civilization is older and more complex than we thought. Every time, the initial reaction from mainstream archaeology is skepticism or dismissal. And every time, as more evidence accumulates, the timeline quietly shifts. Göbekli Tepe is the most dramatic example. When it was first dated, many archaeologists resisted the implications. Now it's in the textbooks. The timeline changed. What was impossible became accepted. If Göbekli Tepe can exist at 9600 BCE, the same date Plato assigns to Atlantis, then a civilization at the Rishat structure during the same period is not inherently impossible. It's within the range of what we now know humans were capable of. That doesn't prove it existed, but it removes the strongest objection, that humans couldn't have built anything significant at that date. We know now that they could. They did at Göbekli Tepe. Let me address something directly. I know how this topic sounds. I know that Atlantis triggers immediate dismissal from serious people. I know that the topic has been polluted by decades of pseudoscience, fantasy, and outright nonsense. And I understand why. For every serious researcher asking legitimate questions about the Rishat structure, there are 100 people claiming Atlantis was powered by crystals, or built by aliens, or connected to psychic energy grids. The noise drowns the signal. And serious scientists, understandably, don't want to be associated with the noise. But here's what I think we lose when we let the noise define the conversation. We lose the ability to ask legitimate questions. The existence of bad Atlantis theories doesn't invalidate good ones. The fact that some people make absurd claims about the Rishat structure doesn't mean all claims about the Rishat structure are absurd. The matching dimensions are not absurd. The concentric ring structure is not absurd. The correlation with the African humid period is not absurd. The absence of systematic investigation is not absurd, it's a problem. I think the honest position is this: we don't know. We don't know if the Rishat structure has any connection to Plato's Atlantis. We don't know if Atlantis was real. But we have a site that matches the description with uncomfortable precision, in a location that was habitable during the right time period. And we've never properly investigated it. That's not a conclusion, it's a starting point. And I think starting points deserve exploration, not dismissal. There's one more thing I want to show you before we close: the destruction timeline. Plato says Atlantis was destroyed approximately 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, which places the destruction around 9,600 BCE. What happened around 9,600 BCE? The Younger Dryas ended. This was a sudden, dramatic climate shift, a return to near-glacial conditions that lasted roughly 1,200 years, from about 10,800 to 9,600 BCE. When the Younger Dryas ended, temperatures rose rapidly, ice sheets melted, sea levels rose dramatically, by some estimates over 100 meters in total over the following millennia. Coastlines changed, ecosystems transformed, the world's climate reorganized. The end of the Younger Dryas also marks the beginning of the African humid period in the Sahara. As global climate patterns shifted, the Sahara received dramatically more rainfall. The desert turned green. So here's the timeline. Around 9,600 BCE, the Younger Dryas ends. The Sahara becomes wet and habitable. A civilization could have emerged in the newly green Sahara, building on the natural ringed formation of the Rishat structure using the abundant water. This civilization flourishes for thousands of years during the African humid period. Then, around 5,000 years ago, the climate shifts again. The Sahara dries, the water disappears. The civilization collapses, its people scatter, its buildings are buried under sand. Its memory survives only in fragments, fragments that eventually reach Egyptian priests, who tell the story to a visiting Greek. And 2,400 years later, Plato writes it down. Is this what happened? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it's a coherent narrative that fits the geological evidence, the climatological evidence, and the textual evidence. It doesn't require aliens. It doesn't require magic. It requires only that humans did what humans have always done: built civilizations where conditions allowed, and lost them when conditions changed. Let me tell you what I think. And I want to be clear that this is my perspective, not established fact. I think the Rishat structure deserves a proper archaeological investigation. Not because I'm certain it's Atlantis, but because the circumstantial evidence is strong enough that ignoring it is intellectually lazy. I think Plato's account, whatever its ultimate origin, contains details that are too specific and too accurate in terms of matching a real geological site to be purely fictional. Something inspired that description. Whether it was the Rishat structure or something else, I don't know. But Plato made it all up feels increasingly inadequate as an explanation. I think the history of human civilization is longer and more complex than we currently acknowledge. Göbekli Tepe proved that. Future discoveries will prove it further. And I think the Rishat structure might be one of those future discoveries, if anyone ever bothers to dig. And I think the biggest obstacle isn't evidence, it's attitude. The attitude that says we already know the answer, so why ask the question? The attitude that says Atlantis is fiction, so anything that resembles it must be coincidence. The attitude that protects careers at the expense of curiosity. That attitude has been wrong before. It was wrong about Göbekli Tepe. It was wrong about the African humid period. It was wrong about the age of human civilization. Maybe it's wrong about this too. The Eye of the Sahara sits in the desert today, visible from space, ignored by archaeology. Its concentric rings match a description written 2,400 years ago with precision that no one has adequately explained. Maybe it's a coincidence. Geological formations can take strange shapes. Maybe Plato invented Atlantis, and the Rishat structure just happens to look like his invention. But maybe, just maybe, we're looking at the remains of something real. Something that existed when the Sahara was green and water filled those rings. Something that was lost when the climate changed and the desert buried everything. If that's true, then the greatest lost city in human history isn't at the bottom of the ocean. It's sitting in plain sight, in the middle of the desert, waiting for someone to take it seriously. The question isn't whether Atlantis was real. The question is whether we have the courage to look. If this changed how you see the Sahara or how you think about lost civilizations, subscribe to Forbidden Echoes. I read every comment. Tell me what you think. Is the Eye of the Sahara just geology, or is it something more? See you next time.